Hey, hey, look, why don't you get your head right? Why don't you get your head right?
Ooh.
Why don't you get your head right?
Okay.
It'll come easy. But you think this shit is coming easy? But you think this shit is really supposed to come in easy? But you think this shit is really supposed to come in easy? Look, get your head right. Hey, ain't no greatness overnight. Hey, get your head right. What you think? Ain't no greatness overnight. Hey, look, get your head right. What you think? One time for the one time, shorty fuck with me, she see ambition.
Shouts out against the world. She, or his alter ego, Go Girl.
Attention is attached like knowledge. I see the legend. I never hop to a mountain. I make a bitch buddy hot pony. She takes the dick and she say it's delicious cold. You know me Eskimo cold and the chain is the same. And you know me out the brain. Chains in the flame, and you know it's all chain when it came bang bang. You let me know the same thing, gang with a bang. I don't care the colors, all I know is black. Melanon, let me know.
Oh man, he's got a bunch of songs on there. I guess we got a couple to choose from if I have to take any sort of break this evening. I probably won't though, let's be honest. So I might make an excuse just to play another one of these. But we really don't have a whole lot of time here, maybe about an hour. So, literally 1984. Um, but the other day I tried to do a live stream. I got through a couple pages, almost. Well, I'm supposed to have probably started on chapter two, or I mean part two again. Or I could just read on from here and be lazy with it. Call this part six at a later date. And that 15, nah, I'll just delete the 15 minutes of other library. Who cares? It was in the middle of the morning. Wednesday had left his cubicle to go to the laboratory. The solitary figure was coming towards him from the other end of a long, brightly lit corridor. It was the girl with dark hair. 4 days had gone past since the evening when she had ran into her outside the junk shop. She came near. He saw that her right arm was in a sling, not noticeable at a distance because it was the same color as her overalls. Probably she had crushed her hand while swinging around with the big kaleidoscopes on which the plots of novels were quote unquote roughed in. It was a common accident in the fiction department. They were perhaps 4 meters apart when the girl stumbled and almost fell flat on her face. A sharp cry of pain was wrung out of her. She must have fallen right on her injured arm. Winston stopped short. The girl had risen to her knees. Her face had turned milky yellow color against with her smooth mouth stood out redder than ever. Her eyes were fixed on his with an appealing expression that looked more like fear than pain. A curious emotion stirred in Winston's heart. In front of him was an enemy who was trying to kill him. In front of him also was a human creature, in pain perhaps with a broken bone. Already he had instinctively started forward to help her. In the moment when he had seen her fall on her bandaged arm, it had been as though he had felt the pain in his own body. "You're hurt," he said. "It's nothing, it's my arm. It'll be all right in a second." She spoke as though her heart were fluttering. She had an extremely pale complexion at this point. "Have you broken anything?" "No, I'm all right. It only hurt for a moment, that's all." She held out a free hand to him. He helped her up. She had regained some of the color and appeared very much better. "It's nothing," she repeated shortly. "I only gave my wrist a bit of a bang. Thanks, comrade." And with that she walked on and the direction in which he had been going as briskly as though it had really been nothing. The whole incident could have taken as much as half a minute, not to let one's feelings appear in one's face. It was a habit that had acquired the status of an instinct. In any case, they had been standing straight in front of a telescreen when the thing happened. Nevertheless, it had been very difficult not to betray a momentary surprise, for in 2 or 3 seconds, while he was helping the girl up, she had slipped something into his hand. There was no question that she had done it intentionally. It was something small and flat, and as he passed through the lavatory door, he transferred it into his pocket and felt it with the tips of his fingers. It was a scrap of paper, folded into a square. While he stood at the urinal, he managed with little more fingering to get it unfolded. Obviously, there must be a message of some kind written on it. For a moment he was tempted to take it into one of the water closets and read it at once, but that would be a shocking folly, as he well knew. There was no place where you could be more certain that the telescreens were watching continuously. He went back to his cubicle, sat down, threw the fragment of paper casually among the other papers on the desk, put on his spectacles, and hitched the speakwrite toward him. 5 minutes, he told himself. 5 minutes at the very least. His heart pumped at his breast with frightening loudness. Fortunately, the piece of work he engaged on was mere routine, the rectification of a long list of figures not needing close attention. Whatever was written on the paper must be some kind of political meaning. So far as he could see, there were two possibilities. One, much more the likely, was that the girl was an agent of the thought police, just as he had feared. He didn't know why the thought police should choose to deliver their messages in such a fashion, but perhaps they had their reasons. The thing that was written on the paper might be a threat, a summons in order to commit suicide, a trap of some kind of description. But there was another wilder possibility that kept raising its head, though he tried vainly to suppress it. This was that the message did not come from the thought police at all, but from some kind of underground organization. Perhaps Perhaps the Brotherhood existed after all. Perhaps the girl was a part of it. No doubt the idea was absurd, but it had sprung into his mind at the very instant of feeling the scrap of paper in his hand. It was not till a couple minutes later that the other, more probable explanation had occurred to him. Even now, through his intellect, though his intellect told him that the message probably meant death, still that was not what he believed, and the unreasonable hope persisted, and his heart banged, and it was with difficulty that he kept his voice from trembling as he murmured with his fingers into the speakwrite. He rolled up the completed bundle of work and slid into the pneumatic tube. 8 minutes had gone by. He readjusted spectacles on his nose, sighed, and drew the next batch of work toward him with a scrap of paper on top of it. He flattened it out. It was written in a large, uniformed handwriting. I love you. For several seconds he was too stunned to even throw the incriminating thing into a memory hole. When he did so, although he knew very well the danger of showing too much interest, he could not resist reading it just once again, just to make sure that the words were really there. For the rest of the morning it was very difficult to work. What was even worse than having to focus his mind on a series of nagging jobs was the need to conceal the agitation from the telescreen. He felt as though a fire were burning in his belly. Lunch in the hot, crowded, noise-filled canteen was torment. He had hoped to be alone for a little while during the lunch hour, but as bad luck would have it, the imbecile Parsons flopped down beside him, the tang of sweat almost defeating the tinny smell of stew, and kept up a stream of talk about the preparations for Hate Week. He was particularly enthusiastic about a papier-mâché model of Big Brother's head 2 meters wide, which was being made for the occasion by his daughter's troop of spies. The irritating thing was that in the racket of voices Winston could hardly hear what Parsons was saying, and was constantly having to ask for some fortuitous remark to be repeated. Just once he caught a glimpse of the girl, at a table with two other girls at the far end of the room. She appeared not to have seen him, and she didn't look in that direction again. The afternoon was more bearable. Immediately after a lunch there arrived a delicate, difficult piece of work which would take several hours and necessitated putting everything else aside. It consisted in falsifying a series of reports built 2 years ago in such a way as to cast discredit on a prominent member of the inner party who was now under a cloud. This was the kind of thing that Winston was good at, and for more than 2 hours he succeeded in shutting the girl out of his mind altogether. Then the memory of her face came back, and with it a raging, intolerable desire to be alone. Until he could be alone, it was impossible to think this new development out. Tonight was one of his nights at the community center. He wolfed another tasteless meal in the canteen, hurried off to the center, took part in the solemn foolery of a discussion group, played 2 games of table tennis, swallowed several glasses of gin, and sat for half an hour through the lecture entitled Ingsoc in Relation to Chess. His soul writhed with boredom, but for once he had no impulse to shirk his evening at the center. At the sight of the words "I love you," the desire to stay alive had welled up in him, and taking the minor risk suddenly seemed stupid. It was not till 23 hours, when he was home and in bed in the darkness, where you were safe even from the telescreen so long as you kept silent, that he was able to think continuously. It was a physical problem that had to be solved: how to get in touch with the girl and arrange a meeting. He did not consider any longer the possibility that she might be laying some kind of trap for him. He knew that was not so because of her unmistakable agitation when she had handed him the note. Obviously she had been frightened out of her wits, and as well as she might be. Nor did the idea of refusing her advances even cross his mind. Only 5 nights ago he had contemplated smashing her skull with a cobblestone, but that was of no importance. The thought of her naked, youthful body as he had seen it in his dream. He had imagined her a fool like the rest of them, her head stuffed with lies and hatred, her belly full of ice. A kind of fever seized him at the thought that he might lose her. The white youthful body might slip away from him. He feared more than anything else that she would simply change her mind if he did not get in touch with her quickly. But the physical difficulty of meeting was enormous. It was like trying to make a move at chess when you were already mated. Whichever way you turned, the telescreen faced you. Actually, all of the possible ways of communicating with her had occurred to him within 5 minutes of reading the note. But now, with what time to think, he went over them one by one, as though laying out a row of instruments on a table. Obviously, the kind of encounter that had happened this morning could not be repeated. If she had worked in the records department, it might have been comparatively simple, but he had only a very dim idea of the whereabouts of the building that the fiction department lay, and he had no pretext in going for there. If he had known where she lived, at what time she left work, he could have contrived to meet her somewhere on his way home, but to try to follow her home was not safe, because it would mean loitering outside of the ministry, which was bound to be noticed. As for sending a letter through the mails, it was out of the question. By routine, that was not even a secret. All letters were opened in transit. Actually, few people even wrote letters. For the message that it was occasionally necessary to send, there were printed postcards with a long list of phrases, and if you stuck out the ones that were applicable. In any case, he didn't know the girl's name, let alone her address. Finally, he decided that the safest place was the canteen. If he could get her at a table by herself, somewhere in the middle of the room, not too near the telescreens, with a sufficient buzz of conversation all around, these conditions endured for, say, 30 seconds, it might be possible to exchange a few words. For a week after this, life was like a restless dream. On the next day she did not appear in the canteen until he was leaving it. The whistle had already blown. Presumably she had changed into a later shift. They passed each other without a glance. On the day after that she was in the canteen at the usual time, but with 3 other girls immediately under a telescreen. Then for 3 dreadful days she did not appear at all. His whole mind and body seemed to be afflicted with an unbearable sensitivity, a sort of transparency, which made every movement, every sound, every contact, every word that he had to speak or listen to, an agony. Even in his sleep he could not altogether escape from her image. He did not touch the diary during those days. If there was any relief, it was in his work, in which he could sometimes forget himself for 10 minutes at a stretch. He had absolutely no clue as to what had happened to her. There was no inquiry he could make. He might have been vaporized. She might have committed suicide. She might have been transferred to the other end of Oceania. Worst and likeliest of all, she might have simply changed her mind and decided to avoid it. The next day she reappeared. Her arm was out of the sling, and she had a band of sticking plaster around her wrist. The relief of seeing her was so great that he could not resist staring directly at her for several seconds. On the following day he very nearly succeeded in speaking to her. When he came into the canteen she was sitting at the table, well out away from the wall, and was quite alone. It was early, and the place was not very full. The queue edged forward till Winston was almost at the counter. Then he was held up for 2 minutes because someone in front was complaining that he had not received his tablet of saccharin. But the girl was still alone when Winston secured his tray and began to make for her table. He casually walked toward her, his eyes searching for a place at some table beyond her. He was perhaps 3 meters away from him. Another 2 seconds would do it. Then a voice behind him called, "Smith!" He pretended not to hear it. "Smith!" repeated the voice more loudly. It was of no use. He turned around. A blond-haired, silly-faced young man named Whistler, whom he barely knew, was inviting him with a smile to a vacant place at his table. It was not safe to refuse. After having been recognized, he could not go on and sit at a table with an unattended girl. It was too noticeable. He sat down with a friendly smile. The silly blonde face beamed into his. Winston had an hallucination of himself smashing a pickaxe right into the middle of it. The girl's table filled up a few minutes later. She must have seen him coming towards her, and perhaps she would take the hint. The next day he took care to arrive early. Sure enough, she was already at the table, about the same place, and alone again. The person immediately ahead of him in the queue was a small, swiftly moving, beetle-like man with a flat face and tiny, suspicious eyes. As Winston turned away from the counter with his tray, he saw the little man was making straight for the girl's table. His hope sank again. There was a vacant place at a table further away, but something in the little man's appearance suggested that he would be sufficiently attentive to his own comfort to choose the emptiest table. With ice at his heart, Winston followed. There was no use he could get at the girl alone. At this moment there was a tremendous crash. The little man was sprawling on all fours. His tray had gone flying. 2 streams of soup and coffee were flowing across the floor. He started to his feet with a malignant glance at Winston, whom he evidently suspected of having tripped him up. But it was all right. 5 seconds later, with a thundering heart, Winston was sitting at the girl's table. He didn't look at her. He unpacked his tray and promptly began eating. It was all important to speak at once before anyone else came, but now a terrible fear had taken possession of him. A week had gone by since she had first approached. She would have changed her mind. She must have changed her mind. It was impossible that this affair should end successfully. Such things didn't happen in real life. He might have flinched altogether from the speaking of it at this moment had he not seen Ampleforth, the hairy-eared poet, wandering limply round the room with a tray, looking for a place to sit down. In his vague way, Ampleforth was attached to Winston and would certainly sit down at the table if he caught sight of him. There was perhaps a minute in which to act. Both Winston and the girl were eating steadily. The stuff they were eating was a thin stew, actually a soup, a haircut beans. In a low murmur, Winston began speaking. Neither of them looked up. Steadily they spooned the watery stuff into their mouths. Between spoonfuls, exchanged the few necessary words in low-key, expressionless voices. "What time do you leave work?" 18:30. "Where can we meet?" "Victory Square, near the monument." "It's full of telescreens." "It doesn't matter if there's a crowd." "Any signal?" "No, don't come up to me till you see me among a lot of people. And don't look at me. Just keep somewhere near me." "What time?" 19 hours. "All right." Ampleforth sailed to see Winston and sat down at another table. The girl finished her lunch off quickly and made off, while Winston stayed to smoke a cigarette. They didn't speak again. And so far as possible for 2 people sitting on opposite sides of the same table, they did not look at each other. Winston was in Victory Square before the appointed time. He wandered round the base of the enormous fluted column, at the top of which Big Brother's statue gazed southward toward the skies where he had vanquished the Eurasian airplanes. East Asian airplanes, it had been a few years ago, in the Battle of Airstrip 1. In the street in front of it there was a statue of a man on horseback which was supposed to represent Oliver Cromwell. A few minutes past the hour the girl had not appeared. Again a terrible fear seized upon Winston. She was not coming. She had changed her mind. He walked slowly up to the north side of the square and got a sort of pale-colored pleasure from identifying St. Martin's Church, whose bells, when it had bells, had chimed, "You owe me 3 farthings." Then he saw the girl standing at the base of the monument, reading or pretending to read a poster which ran spirally up the column. It was not safe to go near her until some more people had accumulated. There were telescreens all round the pediment, but at this moment there was a din of shouting and suddenly a zoom of heavy vehicles from somewhere to the left. Suddenly everyone seemed to be running across the square. The girl nipped nimbly round the lions at the base of the monument and joined in a rush. Winston followed. As he ran he gathered from some shouted remarks that a convoy of Eurasian prisoners were passing. Already a dense mass of people were blocking the south side of the square. Winston, at normal times the kind of person who gravitates to the outer edge of any kind of scrimmage, shoved, butted, and squirmed his way forward into the heart of the crowd. Soon he was within arm's length of the girl, but the way was blocked by an enormous Pole and an almost equally enormous woman, presumably his wife, who seemed to form an impenetrable wall of flesh. Gross. Winston wriggled himself sideways and with a violent lunge managed to drive his shoulder between them. For a moment it felt as though his entrails were being ground to the pulp between the two muscular hips. Then he had broken through, sweating a bit, and was next to the girl. They were shoulder to shoulder, both staring fixedly in front of them. A long line of trucks, with wooden-faced guards armed with submachine guns standing upright in each corner, was passing slowly down the street. In the trucks little yellow men in shabby greenish uniforms were squatting jammed close together. Their sad Mongolian faces gazed out over the sides of the trucks, utterly incurious. Occasionally when a truck jolted, there was a clink-clank of metal. All the prisoners were wearing leg irons. Truckload after truckload of the sad faces passed. Winston knew they were there, but he managed to see them only intermittently. The girl's shoulder and her arm right down to her elbow were pressed against his, her cheek almost near enough for him to feel its warmth. She had immediately taken charge of the situation just as she had done in the canteen. She began speaking in the same expressionless voice as before, with lips barely moving, a mere murmur drowned by the din of voices and the rumbling tracks. "Can you hear me?" "Yes." "Can you get Sunday afternoon off?" "Yes." "Then listen carefully. You'll have to remember this. Go to Paddington Station." With the sort of military precision that astonished him, she outlined the route he was to follow. A half-hour railway journey. Turn left outside of the station, 2 kilometers along the road, a gate on top of a bar missing on it. A path across a field, a grass-grown lane, a track between bushes, a dead tree with moss on it. It was as though she had a map inside her head. "Can you remember all that?" she murmured finally. "Yes." "You turn left, then right, then left again, and the gate's got no top bar." "What time?" "About 15. You may have to wait. I'll get there by another way. Are you sure you'll remember everything?" "Yes." "Then get away from me as quick as you can." She need not have told him that, but for the moment they could not extricate themselves from the crowd. The trucks were still filing past and the people insatiably gaping. At the start there had been a few boos and hisses, but it came only from the party members around the crowd, and had soon stopped. The prevailing emotion was simply curiosity. Foreigners, whether from Eurasia or East Asia, were a kind of strange animal. One literally never saw them, except in the guise of prisoners, and even as prisoners, one never got more than a momentary glimpse of them. Nor did one know what became of them apart from the few who were hanged as war criminals, Others simply vanished, presumably into forced labor camps. The round Mongol faces had given way to faces of more European type, dirty, bearded, and exhausted. From over scrubby cheekbones, eyes looked into Winston's, sometimes with strange intensity, and flashed away again. The convoy was drawing to an end. In the last truck he could see an aged man, his face a mass of grizzled hair, standing upright with wrists crossed in front of him, as though he were used to having them bound together. It was almost time for Winston and the girl to part, but at the last moment when the crowd still held them in, her hand felt for his and gave it a fleeting squeeze. It could not have been 10 seconds, and yet it seemed like a long time that their hands were clasped together. He had time to learn every detail of her hand. He explored the long fingers, the shapely nails, oh my gosh, the work-hardened palm with its row of calluses, the smooth flesh under the wrist. Merely from feeling it, he would have known by sight. At the same instant it occurred to him that he probably did not know what color the girl's eyes were. They were probably brown, but people with dark hair sometimes had blue eyes. He turned his head and looked at her. It would have been inconceivably folly. With hands locked together, invisible among the congress of bodies, they stared steadily in front of them, and instead of the eyes of the girl, the eyes of the aged prisoner gazed mournfully at Winston out of nests of hair. Part 2, Chapter 2 coming up. All kinds of love going out to Against the World G, who hopefully will see that I did play his song on here, because that's pretty dope. I'm glad he's making music again. All kinds of love going out to the r/alternate history of Discord, as well as Renzo Flutes, Raheem, Brittany, Marie, Octawave, of course. All kinds of love to Octawave. Oh man, so many others as well. Just thank you for showing up and showing out. Chapter 2. Winston picked his way up the lane through dappled light and shade, stepping out into pools of gold whenever boughs parted. Under the trees to the left of the ground was misty with bluebells. The air seemed to kiss one's skin. It was the 2nd of May. From somewhere deeper in his heart of the wood came the droning of ringdoves. It was a bit early. There had been no difficulties about the journey, and the girl was so evidently experienced that he was less frightened than he normally would have been. Presumably she could be trusted to find a safe place. In general, you could not assume that you were much safer in the country than in London. There were no telescreens, of course, but there was always the danger of concealed microphones by which your voice could be picked up and recognized. Besides, it was not easy to make a journey by yourself without attracting attention. For distances of less than 100 kilometers, it was necessary to get your passport endorsed. But sometimes there were patrols hanging about the railway stations who examined the papers of any party member they found there and asked awkward questions. However, no patrols had appeared, and on the walk from the station he had made sure to be cautious backwards glances to ensure that he was not being followed. The train was full of proles, in holiday mood because of the summery weather. Their wooden seated carriage in which he travelled was filled to overflowing by a single enormous family ranging from a toothless great-grandmother to a month-old baby, going out to spend an afternoon with in-laws in the country, and, as they freely explained to Winston, to get hold of a little black market butter. The lane widened. In a minute he came to a footpath she had told him of, a mere cattle track which plunged in between the bushes. He had no watch, but it couldn't be 15 yet. The bluebells were so thick underfoot that it was impossible not to tread on them. He knelt down and began picking some up, partially passed the time away. but also from a vague idea that he would like to give a bunch of flowers to offer her when they met. He had got together with a big bunch, and was smelling of their faint scent when the sound at his back froze him. The unmistakable crackle of a foot on twigs. He went on picking bluebells. It was the best thing to do. He might be the girl, or he might have been followed after all. To look round was to show guilt. He picked another and another. A hand fell lightly on his shoulder. He looked up. It was the girl. She shook her head, evidently as a warning that he must keep silent, then parted the bushes, and quickly led the way along the narrow track into the wood. Obviously she had been that way before, for she dodged the foggy pits as though by habit. Winston followed, still clasping his bunch of flowers. His first feeling was relief, but as he watched the strong, slender body moving in front of him, with the scarlet sash that was just tight enough to bring out the curve of her hips, the sense of his own inferiority was heavy upon him. Even now it seemed quite likely that when she turned round and looked at him she would draw back after all. The sweetness of the air and the greenness of the leaves daunted him. Already the walk from the station to May sunshine had made him feel dirty and illodated, a creature of the indoors, with the sooty dust of London in the pores of his skin. It occurred to him that till now she probably had never even seen him in broad daylight in the open. Then came to the fallen tree that she had spoken of. The girl hopped over and forced apart the bushes in which there did not seem to be an opening. When Winston followed her, he found that they were in a natural clearing, the tiny grass knoll surrounded by tall saplings that shut it in completely. The girl stopped and turned. "Here we are," she said. He was facing her at several paces' distance. As yet he did not dare move nearer to her. "I didn't want to say anything in the lane," she went on, "in case there was a mike hidden here. I don't suppose there is, but there could always be. You know, there's a chance of one of those swine recognizing your voice. We're all right here." He had not the courage to approach her. "We're all right here," he repeated stupidly. "Yes, look at the trees." They were all small ashes, which at some time had been cut down and then sprouted up again into a forest of holes, none of them thicker than one's wrist. "There's nothing big enough to hide a mike in. Besides, I've been here before." They were only making conversation. He had managed to move closer to her now. She stood before him, very upright, with a smile on her face that looked faintly ironical, as though she were wondering why he was so slow to act. The bluebells had cascaded onto the ground. They seemed to have fallen of their own accord. He took her hand. "Would you believe," he said, "at this very moment I didn't know what color your eyes were?" They were brown, he noted, a rather light shade of brown with dark lashes. "Now that you've seen what I'm rarely like, can you still bear to look at me?" "Yes, easily." "Oh, that's opposite. Now that you've seen what I'm rarely like, can you still bear to look at me?" "Yes, easily." "I'm 39 years old. I've got a wife that I can't get rid of. I've got varicose veins. I've got 5 false teeth." "I couldn't care less," said the girl. At that moment it was hard to say by whose act she was in his arms. At the beginning he had no feeling except sheer incredulity. The youthful body was strained against his own, the mass of dark hair was against his face, and yes, she actually had turned her face up and was kissing the wide red mouth. She had clasped her arms around his neck. She was calling him darling, precious one, loved one. He pulled her down onto the ground. She was utterly unresisting. He could do what he liked with her, but the truth was that he had no physical sensation except that of mere contact. All that he felt was incredulity and pride. He was glad that this was happening, but he had no physical desire. It was too soon. Her youth and prettiness had frightened him. He was too much used to living without women. He didn't know the reason. The girl picked herself up and pulled a blue bell out of her hair. She sat against him, putting her arm around her waist. "Never mind, dear, there's no hurry. We've got the whole afternoon." Isn't this a splendid hideout? I found it when I got lost once on a community hike. If anyone was coming, you'd hear them 100 meters away. What is your name? Winston said. Julia, I don't know yours. It's Winston. Winston Smith. How'd you find that out? I expect I'm better at finding things out than you are, dear. Tell me, why did you think of me that day before I gave you the note? He did not feel any temptation to tell lies to her. It was even a sort of love offering to start off by telling the worst. Why, I hated the sight of you, he said. I wanted to rip you and then murder you afterwards. 2 weeks ago I thought seriously of smashing your head in with a cobblestone. If you really want to know, I had imagined that you had something to do with the thought police. The girl laughed delightedly, evidently taking this as a tribute to the excellence of her disguise. Not the thought police? You didn't honestly think that? Oh, well, perhaps not that, but from your general appearance, merely because you're young and fresh and healthy, you understand. I thought that probably you thought that I was a good party member, pure in word and deed. Banners, associations, slogans, games, community hikes, all that stuff. And you thought that I had a quarter of a chance I did now choose the thought criminal and get you killed off? Yes, something of the kind. A great many young girls are like that, you know. But this bloody thing that does it, she said, ripping off the scarlet sash of her junior anti-sex league and flinging it into her bow. Then, as though touching her waist had reminded her of something, she felt in the pocket of her overalls and produced a small slab of chocolate. She broke it in half and gave one of the pieces to Winston. Even before he had taken it, he knew by the smell that it was very unusual chocolate. It was dark and shiny and wrapped in a silver paper. Chocolate was normally dull, brown, crumbly stuff that tasted as nearly as one could describe to it like the smoke of a rubbish fire. But at some time or another he had tasted chocolate like the piece she had given him. The first whiff of its scent had stirred up some memory which he could not yet pin down, but was powerful and troubling. Black market, she said indifferently. Actually, I am that sort of girl to look at. I'm good at games. I was a troop leader in the Spires. I do voluntary work, 3 evenings a week for the Junior Anti-Sex League. Hours and hours I've spent pasting their bloody rot all over London. I always carry one end of a banner in the processions. I always look cheerful and never shirk anything. I always yell with the crowd, that's what I say. It's the only way to be safe. The first fragment of chocolate melted on Winston's tongue. The taste was delightful, but there was still that memory moving around the edges of his consciousness, something that strongly felt but not ridiculable to definite shape, like an object seen out of the corner of one's eye. He pushed it away from him, aware that it was only the memory of some action which he would rather have liked to undo, but could not. You were very young, he said. You were easily 10 or possibly 15 years younger than I am. What could see you to attract to a man like me? If there was something in your face, I thought I'd take a chance. I'm good at spotting people who don't belong. As soon as I saw you, I knew you were against them. Them, it appeared, meant the party, and above all the inner party, about whom she talked with an open, jeering hatred which made Winston feel uneasy, although he knew they were safe here if they could be safe anywhere. The thing that astonished him about her was the coarseness of her language. Party members were not supposed to swear, and Winston himself very seldom did swear aloud at any rate. Julia, however, seemed unable to mention the party, and especially the inner party, without using the kind of words that you saw chalked up in dripping alleyways. He did not dislike it. It was merely one symptom of her revolt against the party in all its ways, and somehow it seemed natural and healthy, like the sneeze of a horse that smells bad hay. They had left the clearing and were wandering again through the checkered shade, with their arms round each other's waists, whenever it was safe for the two of them to walk abreast. He noticed how much softer her waist seemed to feel now that the sash was gone. They didn't speak above a whisper. Outside the clearing, Julius said it was better to go quietly. Presently they had reached the edge of the little wood. She stopped him. "Don't go into the open. There might be someone watching. We're all right if we keep behind the boughs." They were standing in the shade of hazel bushes, sunlight filtering through innumerable leaves. It was hot on their faces. Winston looked out into the field beyond and underwent a curious, slow shock of recognition. He knew it by sight. An old, close-bitten pasture, with a footpath wandering across it, and a mole here and there, and a ragged hedge on the opposite side of the boughs of the elm trees swayed as perceptibly in the breeze, and their leaves stirred faintly in the dense masses like a woman's hair. Surely somewhere nearby but out of sight there must be a stream with green pools where dace were swimming. "Is there a stream somewhere near here?" he whispered. "That's right, there's a stream. It's at the edge of the next field, actually. There are fish in it, great big ones. You can watch them lying in the pools under the willow trees, waving their tails." "It's the golden country, almost," he murmured. "The golden country? Oh, nothing really. A landscape I've seen sometimes in a dream." "Look," whispered Julia. The thrush had alighted on a bough not 5 meters away, almost at level with their faces. Perhaps they had not seen him. It was in the sun, they in the shade. It spread out its wings, fitted them carefully into place again, ducked its head for a moment as though it was making some sort of obeisance to the sun, and then began to pour forth a torrent of song. In the afternoon hush the volume of the song was startling. Winston and Julie come together, fascinated. The music went on and on, minute after minute, with astonishing variations, never once repeating itself, almost as though the bird were deliberately showing off its virtuosity. Sometimes it stopped for a few seconds, spread out, and resettled its wings, then swelled its speckled breast again and burst into song. Winston watched it with a sort of vague reverence. For whom, for what, was that bird singing? No mate, no rival was watching it. What made it sit at the edge of the lonely wood and pour out its music into nothingness? He wondered whether, after all, there was a microphone hidden somewhere near. He and Julia had only spoken in low whispers. It would not pick up what they had said, but it would pick up the thrush. Perhaps at the other end of this instrument some small beetle-like man was listening intently, listening to that. But by degrees the flood of music drove all speculations out of his mind. It was as though it were a kind of liquid stuff that had poured all over him and got mixed up with the sunlight that filtered through the leaves. He stopped thinking and merely felt. The girl's waist and the bend of his arm was soft and warm. He pulled her round so that they were breast to breast. Her body seemed to melt into his. Wherever his hands moved, it was all yielding his water. Their mouths clung together. It was quite different from the hard kisses they had exchanged earlier. They moved their faces apart again. Both of them sighed deeply. The bird took flight and fled with a clatter of wings. Winston put his lips to her ear. "Now," he whispered. "Not here," she whispered back. "Come back to the hideout. It's safer." Occasionally, with a crackle of twigs, they treaded their way back to the clearing. When they were once inside the ring of saplings, she turned and faced him. They were both breathing fast, but the smile had reappeared round the corners of her mouth. She stood looking at him for an instant, then felt at the zipper of her overalls. And yes, it was almost as in his dream. Almost as swiftly as he had imagined it, she tore her clothes off and flung them aside, as with that same magnificent gesture by which the whole civilization seemed to be annihilated. Her body gleamed white in the sun. But for a moment he didn't look at her body. His eyes were anchored by the freckled face with its faint, bold smile. He knelt down before her and took her hands into his. "Have you done this before?" "Why, of course. Scores of times. Well, anyway, with party members. Yes, always with party members. With members of the inner party? Not those who I know. There's plenty that would if they got half a chance. They're not so holy as they make out. His heart leapt. Scores of times she'd done it. He wished it had been hundreds, thousands. Anything that hinted at corruption always filled him with wild hope. Who knew, perhaps the party was rotten under the surface, its cult of strenuousness and self-denial simply a sham concealing inequity. If he could have infected the whole lot of them with leprosy or syphilis, how gladly he would have done so. Anything to rot, to weaken, to undermine. He pulled her down so that they were kneeling face to face. Listen, the more men you've had, the more I love you. Do you understand? Yes, perfectly. I hate purity. I hate goodness. I don't want any virtue to exist anywhere. I want everyone to be corrupt to the bones. Well, I ought to suit you, dear. I'm corrupt to the bones. You like doing this? I don't simply mean me, I mean the thing in itself. Yes, I adore it. That was above all what he wanted to hear. Not merely the love of one person, but the animal instinct, the simple, undifferentiated desire that was the force that would tear the party to pieces. He pressed her down in the grass among the fallen bluebells. This time there was no difficulty. Presently the rising and falling of their breasts slowed to normal speed, and in a sort of pleasant helplessness they fell apart. The sun seemed to have grown hotter. They were both sleepy. He reached out for the discarded overalls and pulled them partly over her. Almost immediately they fell asleep and slept for about half an hour. Winston woke first. He sat and watched the freckled face, still peacefully asleep, pillowed on the palm of her hand. Except for her mouth, you could not call her beautiful. There was a line or two round the eyes if you looked closely. The short, dark hair was extraordinarily thick and soft. It occurred to him that he still did not know her surname or where she lived. The young, strong body, now helpless in sleep, awoke in him a pitying, protecting feeling, but in the mindless tenderness he had felt under the hazel tree, while the thrush was singing, had not quite come back. He pulled the overalls aside and studied her smooth flank. In the old days, he thought, a man looked at his girl's body and saw that it was desirable, and that was the end of the story. But you could not have pure love or pure lust nowadays. No emotion was pure because everything was mixed up in fear and hatred. Their embrace had been a battle, a climax of victory. It was a blow struck against the party. It was a political act. Shouts out, "Fuck the way!" Shouts out, "Against the world!" Gee. Oh my goodness. Mad love to Renzo Flutes, all the fans over at the r/alternate history hub Discord page. Yes, Raheem, Brittany. Oh man, several others as well. Don't watch, continue. We on chapter 3. We got about 27 minutes left till the library kicks us off the computer here, so we can probably finish the chapter. Yeah, I think we can do this. Smash that like button, y'all. Part 2, Chapter 3. Literally 1984. We can come out here again, said Julia. It's generally safe to use the hideout twice, but not for another month or two, of course. As soon as she woke up, her demeanor changed. She became alert and businesslike, put her clothes on, and knotted the scarlet sash about her waist, and began arranging the details of the journey home. It seemed natural to leave this to her. She obviously had a practical cunning, which Winston lacked. She also seemed to have an exhaustive knowledge of the countryside around London, stored away from some innumerable community hikes. The route she gave was quite different from the one by which he had come, and brought him out a different railway station. Never go home the same way you went out, she said as though enunciating an important general principle. She would leave first, and Winston was to wait half an hour before following her. She had named the place where they could meet after work 4 evenings hence. It was a street in one of the poorer quarters, where there was an open market which was generally crowded and noisy. She would be hanging out among the stalls, pretending to be in search of shoelaces or sewing thread. If she judged that the coast was clear, she would blow her nose when he approached; otherwise he was to walk past her without recognition. But with luck, in the middle of the crowd it would be safe to talk for a quarter of an hour and arrange another meeting. "And now I must go," she said as soon as he had mastered his instructions. "I'm due back at 19:30. I've got to put in 2 hours for the Junior Anti-Sex League. Handing out leaflets or something. Isn't it bloody? Give me a brush down, would you? Have I got any twigs in my hair? Are you sure? Then goodbye, my love, goodbye." She flung herself into his arms, kissed him almost violently, and a moment later pushed her way through the saplings and disappeared into the wood with very little noise. Even now he had not found out her surname or her address. However, it made no difference, for it was inconceivable that they could ever meet indoors or exchange any kind of written communication. As it happened, they never went back to the clearing in the wood. During the month of May there was only one further occasion on which they actually succeeded in making love. That was in another hiding place known to Julia, the belfry of a ruined church in an almost deserted stretch of the community, where an atomic bomb had fallen 30 years earlier. It was a good hiding place once you got there, but getting there was very dangerous. For the rest, they could only meet in the streets, in a very different place every evening, and never for more than half an hour at a time. In the street it was usually possible to talk after a fashion. As they drifted down the crowded pavements, not quite abreast and never looking at one another, they carried on a curious intermittent conversation which flicked on and off like the beams of a lighthouse, suddenly nipped into silence by the approach of a party member uniform, or the proximity of a telescreen, and taken up again minutes later in the middle of a sentence, then cut short as they parted at the agreed spot, then continued almost without introduction on the following day. Julie appeared to be quite used to this kind of conversation, which she called "talking by installments." She was also surprisingly adept at speaking without moving her lips. Just once in almost a month of these nightly meetings they managed to exchange a kiss. They were passing in silence down a side street. Julia would never speak when they were away from the main streets. When there was a deafening roar, the earth heaved and the air darkened, and Winston found himself lying on his side, bruised and terrified. A rocket bomb must have been dropped quite near at hand. Suddenly he became aware of Julia's face a few centimeters from his own, deathly white as cock. Even her lips were white. She was dead. He clasped her against him and found that he was kissing a live, warm face. But there was some powdery stuff that got in the way of his lips. Both of their faces were thickly coated with plaster. There were evenings when they reached their rendezvous when they had to walk past one another without a sign, because a patrol had just come round the corner or a helicopter was hovering overhead. Even if it had been less dangerous, it would still have been difficult to find a time to meet. Winston's working week was 6 hours, 60 hours, and Julia's was even longer, and the free days varied according to the pressure of work and often did not coincide. Julia, in any case, seldom had an evening completely free. She spent an astonishing amount of time attending lectures and demonstrations, distributing literature for the Junior Anti-Sex League, preparing banners for Hate Week, making collections for the Savings Campaign, and such like activities. It paid, she said. It was camouflage. If you kept the small rules, you could break the big ones. She even induced Winston to mortgage yet another of his evenings by enrolling himself in a part-time munition work, which was done voluntarily by zealous party members. So one evening every week, Winston spent 4 hours of paralyzing boredom screwing together small bits of metal which were probably parts of bomb fuses, in draughty, ill-lit workshop, where the knocking of hammers mingled drearily with the music of the telescreens. When they met in the church tower, the gaps in their fragmentary conversation were filled up. It was a blazing afternoon, The air in this little square chamber above the bells was hot, stagnant, smelt overpoweringly of pigeon dung. They sat talking for hours on the dusty, twig-littered floor, one or the other of them just getting up from time to time to cast a glance through the narrow slits and make sure that no one was coming. Julie was 26 years old. She lived in a hostel with 30 other girls. "Always in the stink of women. How I hate women," she said parenthetically. As she worked, as he had guessed, on the novel-writing machines in the fiction department, she enjoyed her work, which consisted chiefly in running and servicing a powerful but tricky electric motor. She was not clever, but fond of using her hands and felt at home with machinery. She could describe the whole process of composing a novel, from the general directive issued by the planning committee down to the final touching up by the rewrite squad. But she was not interested in the finished product. She didn't much care for reading, she said. Books were just a commodity that had to be produced like jam or bootlaces. She had no memories of anything before the early 60s. She had The only person she had ever known who talked frequently on the days before the Revolution was a grandfather who disappeared when she was 8. At school she had been a captain of the hockey team and had won gymnastics trophy 2 years running. She had been the troop leader in the Spies and a branch secretary in the Youth League before joining the Junior Anti-Sex League. She had always borne an excellent character. She had even an infallible mark of good reputation, been picked out to work in Pornosec, the subsection of the fiction department which turned out cheap pornography for the distribution among the proles. It was nicknamed Muck House by the people who worked in it, she remarked. There she had remained for a year, helping to produce booklets in sealed packets with the titles like "Spanking Stories" or "One Night in a Girls' School," to be brought furtively by the proletarian youths who were under the impression that they were buying something illegal. "What are these books like?" said Winston curiously. "Oh, ghastly rubbish. They're boring, really. They only have 6 plots, but they swap them round a bit. Of course, I was only in the kaleidoscopes. I never had the rewrite squad. I'm not literary, dear. I'm not even enough for that." He leaned with astonishment that all the workers in the pornosec, except the head of the department, were girls. The theory was that men whose sex instincts were less controllable than those of women were in greater danger of being corrupted by the filth they handled. "They don't even like having married women there," she added. "Girls were always supposed to be so pure. Here's one who isn't, anyway." She had had her first love affair when she was 16, with a party member of 60 who later committed suicide to avoid arrest. "And a good job, too," said Julia. "Otherwise they'd have had my name out of him when he confessed." Since then there had been various others. Life, as she saw it, was quite simple. You wanted a good time, they, meaning the party, wanted to stop you having it. You broke the rules as best you could. She seemed to think just as natural that they should want to rob you of your pleasures as that you should want to avoid being caught. She hated the party and said so in the crudest words, but she made no general criticism of it. Except where it touched upon her own life, she had no interest in party doctrine. He noticed that she never used newspeak words except the ones that had been passed into everyday use. She had never even heard of the Brotherhood and refused to believe in its existence. Any kind of organized revolt against the party, which was bound to failure, struck her as stupid. The clever thing was to break the rules and stay alive all the same. He wondered vaguely how many others like her there might be in the younger generation, people who had grown up in the world of the Revolution, knowing nothing else, accepting the party as something unalterable like the sky, not rebelling against the authority, but simply evading it, as rabbit dodges a dog. They had not discussed the possibility of getting married. It was too remote to be worth thinking about. No imaginable committee would ever sanction such a marriage if Catherine, Winston's wife, could somehow have been gotten rid of. It was hopeless even as a daydream. "What was she like, your wife?" said Julia. "She was. Do you know the Newspeak word 'good thinkful,' meaning naturally orthodox, incapable of thinking a bad thought?" No, I didn't know the word, but I know the kind of person right enough. He began telling the story of his married life, but curiously enough, she appeared to know the essential parts of it already. She described it to him almost as though she had seen or felt it. The stiffening of Catherine's body as soon as he touched her, the way in which she still seemed to be pushing him from her with all her strength, even when his arms were clasped tightly round him. With Julia he had no difficulty in talking about such things. Catherine, in any case, had long ceased to be a painful memory and had become merely a distasteful one. "I could have stood for it hadn't been for one thing," he said. He told her about the frigid little ceremony that Catherine had forced him to go through on the same night every week. "She hated it, but nothing would make her stop doing it. She used to call it, but you'll never guess." "Our duty for the party," said Julia promptly. "How did you know that?" "I've been at school too, dear. Sex talks once a month for our over-16s and the youth movement. They rub it into you for years. I dare say it works in a lot of cases. But of course you can never tell. People are such hypocrites." She began to enlarge on the subject. With Julia, everything came back to her own sexuality. As soon as this was touched on in any way she was capable of great acuteness. Unlike Winston, she grasped the inner party meaning of sexual puritanism. It was not merely that sex instinct created a world of its own which was outside of the party's control and which therefore had to be destroyed if possible. What was more important was that sexual privation induced hysteria, which was desirable because it could be transformed into war, fever, and leader worship. The way she put it was, "When you make love, you're using up energy, and afterwards you'll feel happy and don't give a damn for anything. They can't bear you to feel like that. They want you to be bursting with energy all the time. All this marching up and down, cheering and waving flags is simply sex gone sour. If you're happy inside yourself, why should you get excited about Big Brother and the 3-year plans and the 2 minutes hate and all the rest of that bloody rot?" It was very true, he thought. There was a direct, intimate connection between chastity and political orthodoxy. For how could they fear the hatred and the lunatic credulity which the party needed in its members to be kept at the right pitch except by bottling down some powerful instinct and using it as a driving force? Sex impulse was dangerous to the party, and the party had turned it into account. They had played a similar trick with the instinct of parenthood. Family could not actually be abolished, and indeed people were encouraged to be fond of their children in almost the old-fashioned way. The children, on the other hand, were systematically turned against their parents, taught to spy on them and report deviations. The family had become, in effect, an extension of the thought police. It was a device by the means of which um, everyone could be surrounded night and day by informers who knew him immediately. Abruptly in his mind he went back to Catherine. Catherine would unquestionably have denounced him to the thought police if she had not happened to be too stupid to detect the unorthodoxy of his opinions. But what really recalled her to him at this moment was that she was that stifling heat of the afternoon which had brought the sweat out of his forehead. He began telling Julia of something that had happened, or rather had failed to happen, on another sweltering summer evening 11 years ago. It was 3 or 4 months after they were married. They had lost their way on a community hike somewhere in Kent. They had only lagged behind the others for a couple of minutes, but they took a wrong turn, and presently found themselves pulled up short by the edge of an old chalk quarry. It was a sheer drop of 10 or 20 meters with boulders at the bottom. There was nobody who could ask the way. As soon as she realized they were lost, Catherine became very uneasy. To be away from the noisy mob of hikers even for a moment gave her a feeling of wrongdoing. She wanted to hurry back by the way they had came and start searching for the other direction. But at that moment Winston noticed some tufts of loose strife growing in the cracks on the cliff beneath them. One tuft was 2 colors, magenta and bright red, apparently growing on the same root. He had never seen anything of the kind before. He called out to Catherine to come and have a look at it. Look, Catherine, look at those flowers. They clump down near the bottom. Do you see the two different colors? She'd already turned to go, but she did rather fretfully come back for a moment. She even leaned out over the cliff face to see where he was pointing. He was standing a little behind her, and he put his hand to her waist to steady her. At this moment it suddenly occurred to him how completely alone they were. There was not a human creature anywhere, not a leaf stirring, not even a bird awake. In a place like this the danger that there would be a hidden microphone was very small, and even if there was a microphone it would only pick up sounds. It was the hottest, sleepiest hour of the afternoon. The sun blazed down on them. The sweat trickled off his face, and the thought struck on him. "Well, why didn't you give her a good shove?" said Julia. "I would have." "Yes, dear, you would have. I would have if I'd been the same person that I am now. Or perhaps I would. I'm not so certain." "Are you sorry you didn't?" "Yes, on the whole I'm sorry I didn't." They were sitting side by side on the dusty floor. He pulled her closer against him. Her head rested on his shoulder, the pleasant smell of her hair conquering the pigeon dung. She was very young, he thought, still expected something from life. She did not understand that to push an inconvenient person over a cliff solves nothing. "Actually, it would have made no difference," he said. "Then why are you sorry you didn't do it?" "Oh, because I prefer a positive to a negative. In this game that we're playing we can't win. Some kinds of failure are better than other kinds, that's all." He felt her shoulders give a wriggle of dissent. She always contradicted him when he said anything of this kind. She wouldn't accept it as a law of nature that the individual was always defeated. In a way she realized that she herself was doomed, that sooner or later the thought police would catch her and kill her. But with another part of her mind she believed that it was somehow possible to construct a secret world in which you could live as you choose. All you needed was luck and cunning and boldness. She didn't understand that there was no such thing as happiness, that the only victory lay in the far future, long after you were dead, that for the moment of declaring war on the party it was better to think of yourself as a corpse. "We are the dead," he said. "We are not dead yet," said Julia prosaically. "Not physically. 6 months, a year, 5 years conceivably. I'm afraid of death. You are young, so presumably you're more afraid of it than I am. Obviously we shall put it off as long as we can, but it makes little difference. As long as human beings stay human, death and life are the same thing." "Oh, rubbish! Which would you sooner sleep with, me or a skeleton? Don't you enjoy being alive? Don't you like the feeling? This is me, this is my hand, this is my leg. I'm real, I'm solid, I'm alive. Don't you like this?" She twisted herself round, put her bosom against him. He could feel her breast ripe yet firm through her overalls. Her body seemed to be pouring some of its youth and vigor into his. "Yes, I like that," he said. "Then stop talking about dying. Now listen, dear, we've got to fix up about the next time we meet. We may as well go back to the place in the wood. We've given it a good long rest. But you must get there by a different way this time. I've got it all planned out. You take the train, but look, I'll draw it out for you." And in her practical way she scraped together a small square of dust with a twig from a pigeon's nest and began drawing a map on the floor. There we are. 3 chapters of part 2. Let's see here. We will continue with part 2, chapter 4. And that's the only thing I'm screaming is oh. And that's all that screaming over everything. Every that motherfuckers is oh. Psych. Not psych. I love Flo. But just all kinds of love going out to Against the World. Gee. Don't watch, continue. Dog Rose. People on the r/alternate history hub Discord, as well as Rakim, Brittany, Octawave, um, Renzo Flutes, always others as well. Anderson Township Library. We go out the same way we went in. Alright, y'all. One love, y'all. Go world. I'm Bad Lad. One love. Peace.